Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of the Business for Unicorns podcast. How are y'all doing today? Thanks for being here. As a quick reminder, if you have not subscribed to this podcast or left us a review, please go do that. We always want to hear your feedback about what you want us to talk about. So email us. It's Michael@businessforunicorns.com. Today it's Mark@businessforunicorns.com. And welcome to the stage, Mark Fisher. How are you, my friend?
I am good. Great to be back. I hope that everyone will go and like and review our podcast so that I can continue to convince my wife to welch on my child rearing duties and come say words on the microphone.
Yeah, well, let's start there because since you've last entered this podcast arena, you're now a dad.
Yeah.
So congratulations, my friend. How's it been feeling?
Pretty great overall. I'm sure many of our listeners know what it's like when you have a child. It is definitely challenging. It takes some time. Have to say the advantage of being the older dad train and perhaps having a very normal child is it's like basically exactly what I thought it would be. It's tiring, but it's nice. And, she sleeps pretty well comparatively for newborns. So I've not had too bad of a challenge. And my wife is incredible. So that helps too, because she's, doing the breastfeeding, which I'm not able to contribute to. So all in all, going great. She's adorable. Enjoying this time, and then also looking forward to the times where we can engage a little bit more. As at current, she doesn't have a lot of engagement yet because her brain's not developed yet.
Just eating, pooping, sleeping, a little barfing.
Exactly what she should be doing.
Well, I'm so glad that's going well. Congratulations, and welcome back to the podcast. We missed you.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Yeah, and for your first one back, we're doing something extra fun, which is, I don't know what the fuck we're talking about. So it's a surprise topic to me that Mark's going to introduce, and I'm stoked for it. So take it away. Yeah,
so I'll tee this up. This is something I've been thinking about recently, inspired by a couple of things I've been reading, and it's on the topic of leadership, which I know you have spent time in the academy studying, and I've been sort of formulating a pet theory that may or may not be stupid. So I kind of wanted to run it by you in real time and get your 2 cents on this. So
Great.
Interestingly enough, this was inspired by a podcast I thought was really good and a podcast I thought was really stupid. So I will not name the guilty, but the stupid podcast, the gist of it was they were these two young gentlemen, probably masterminds, into business. And they were talking about leadership. And I was like, oh, this is very interesting because these young gentlemen, they're really saying a lot of the right things. But it was almost as if, oh, you're actually just saying like business book bromides, right? And you likely have an audience of other young white men that are listening to you. They're like, oh, cool. And they were saying the right things, right? And they were passionate, like, people aren't assets, they're people. I'm like, okay, that's cool. I know the etymology of that phrase, right? So like I've read all the books, so I get where these coming from. And the thing that is maybe not entirely accurate, maybe not fair, is as I was listening to these gentlemen speak, it felt to me that, oh, you haven't actually done any of this yet. You're just talking about it. There's no actual scars. There's no wounds. And to be clear, I'm really not knocking them because it's actually awesome that they're thinking about this. I agreed with much of what they were saying. I think they care deeply about being leaders that are positively impacting the lives of the people they work with. And it just seemed to me like, oh, you have not really actually done this and you're just speaking bromides, right? Now, the other thing that had me thinking about the topic of leadership and as it relates to experience and specifically age is there is a new book by a journalist named Arthur Brooks, who writes for The Atlantic a lot. And I listened to him. I don't know if you caught this. He was on the Sam Harris podcast talking about as we age, the type of intelligences our brains are adept at change. So when you are a younger individual, like the initial podcast hosts, which seem like really, really sweet guys, you tend to have an easier time being innovative, being creative. You think outside the box. You have stamina. You have energy. And if you're really looking for the superstar employee that's going to heroically work endless hours and drive the startup and think of something new and innovate and change the industry, usually that type of disruption by definition requires a younger individual because their brain has more of what this author refers to as fluid intelligence. However, as we get older, we tend to get better at using what the author referred to as crystallized intelligence, right? And this, and again, I'm probably bastardizing all this, by the way. So if anybody's listening is a real scientist, right, you've got this wrong. You're not a psychologist. But that as we get older, of course, we get more myelinated, if you will, right? Which is to say we get more caught in our grooves. But we also get better at pattern recognition. We get more efficient at things because we can just see what's happening more quickly. We get better at analysis. We get better at strategy. I would offer that for a lot of individuals, it's been my experience, you actually even can get better at empathy. You've just lived longer. You've had more experiences. So it's a little bit easier to step outside of your own shoes. And at least for myself is what I aspire to be more generous and charitable and realize if I'm seeing someone behave in a way that's not really making any sense to me, that's a warning sign there's something that I don't know. There's something I'm not knowing about what's going on with that individual. And it's a little easier for me the older I've gotten to get curious instead of just being like, why are they acting like a jerk? Right? So where I'd love to get your 2 cents and your reflections on all of that is, it's making me wonder, can you be a great leader when you're very young? And I don't know. Like, I'm not saying certainly that you can't be a very good leader when you're young. And I also think there's a distinction to be made between probably age and experience, right? Because the final thing that I'll offer this is my own of late feeling like I've really found a blossoming of my leadership that truly took 10 years, right? And maybe this was an unhelpful limiting belief I cast upon myself because I can remember, 10 years ago at MFF thinking to myself, like, wow, I could be really good at leadership in 10 more years if I just for 10 more years. And now, not that I don't mess up sometimes, because Lord knows I still mess up. I'm still not perfect, but it has felt like it's gotten a lot easier for me. I'm better at setting expectations up front. And a lot of that, I think, is pattern recognition. I just have a lot of reps at the various component parts of leadership. And I'm aspiring to also keep the flexibility and self-awareness, which I know you've spoken of before on this podcast. So I'll pull it there. What are your thoughts on this? Is that jive with anything you've seen in the research or any of your own experience?
Yeah, well, I think there's so much to say about this. I'll try and keep this under 3 hours, but I think it's a fascinating conversation. I'll start here, which is echoing the first thing you said, which is that leadership is one of the most studied fields in all of social psychology. It's one of the most studied topics in all the literature. There's so much information out there about it, and when you boil that research down, the 2 character traits, as I've mentioned in this podcast before, they're the only ones consistently aligned with predicting positive outcomes for leaders, is self-awareness and learning agility. And so I do think that, and there is evidence to show that self-awareness and learning agility actually are correlated with age and experience. Right? That you actually have less self-awareness when you're younger, but you actually have more learning agility because you're willing to break shit faster and try shit and take risks. And those 2 things I think are, reversely correlated as you age, right? And so you become probably more self-aware, as you've mentioned, with experience and empathy building and all that life experience. You're likely to, I should say. That's probably not true for every single person. And you're likely to become more risk adverse as you age, and less likely to step outside your comfort zone and learn new shit on a regular basis. So that's something to reflect on. I think the other thing that's really interesting is that there's a lot of new research that I'm really just learning about right now that decenters the person from the concept of leadership. And there's a lot of research that points to leadership as not a person, but leadership is an outcome. And leadership is an outcome of behaviors that are mainly defined by followership, right? And I'll keep talking about that because it's maybe a strange concept. But the idea is that what makes a great leader is based in the context of what the followers actually need or want in any given moment. Right? So can you be a 20-year-old person who is interacting with a group of people, really understands what they need, and be available to them in all the ways that they need someone to be available to them in your 20s? Probably, right? When you think of defining leadership as not a set of inherent traits that one person has to learn, but it's a response to what followership demands of them in a startup or in regardless of their context. So it's so context dependent. That's another thing that's really interesting, is that it really depends on someone's ability to interact well with their context, which includes learning agility, self-awareness, right? Those things are relevant because so much of it is, and we've had the same experience at Mark Fisher Fitness, right? The kind of leaders we were for the people we hired and worked with in the first few years is very different than the kind of leader we are for the people we're hiring today. And for reasons having to do with us as people, but even more for the reasons for who they are today and what they need from the work today. So anyway, that's maybe a convoluted way of answering, but I think there's layers of this, and I like the idea, and I plan on exploring this more, of decentering leadership from a kind of a single person and thinking about leadership as finding the right character traits and skills in a single person, and thinking about it more contextually about it being a relational skill that's mainly defined by followership. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I need to think on it more. I'm intrigued by this. I certainly, as we maybe try to help our listeners, which are predominantly training gym owners, to think through what does this mean for you? What does this mean for how you're interacting with your employees? I think that it occurs to me that one of the great challenges of leadership, and perhaps this relates to this followership idea, which maybe you could take another pass at explaining. I don't think I've got my arms around it yet.
I can give a summary, right? For example, I'll just use a training example, right? Right. You are only as good of a trainer as you are understanding the people you train. Mm-hmm. Right? Right. And so if you want to be someone who's primarily helping people with fat loss, you've got to really understand the challenges that people have who have the goal of fat loss. Right. Same thing as a leader. If you really want to be a leader for a gym full of people who are personal trainers or front desk workers or cleaners, you really understand the needs and the challenges of the people that you are meant to serve. It's kind of a servant leadership idea in many ways, right? That, part of being a leader is being a servant to the people that you want to lead. And so I think that's probably the lens that's maybe most valuable here for our listeners, right? Is thinking about how well do you think you really understand the needs of the people you're trying to be a leader for? That goes for your clients. That also goes for your team. Also maybe goes for your community, right? Who are all the stakeholders who you are trying to be in service to? And how well do you understand their needs? And how well do you understand your role in helping them achieve those needs, right? Are you someone who directly solves problems for them? Are you someone who creates space for them to solve their own problems? Are you someone who connects them to resources and opportunities to help other people help them solve their problems? Like, your role in leadership is not always handing over solutions, right? You have there's lots of other ways you can be of service to people, but there's something about that the needs of the people you're serving are the things that dictate the skills and experiences you need as a leader. Yeah, is that helpful at all, or is that more circular?
I think it is, and this is maybe getting, apologies listeners, too philosophical and potentially fatalistic in a way that's not helpful, and maybe you can offer some positive thoughts. When we have this type of conversation and we look at it through this lens, I think the thing that strikes me is how much of leadership has to seem to me to be ascribed partly to the luck of the draw of the organization you're in, of the people you've chosen, of the way the organization evolves, where it seems also true that while we can have agility, and that's a valuable thing to aspire to, that we will all tend to have certain approaches, certain styles that invariably we just lean on, we're more comfortable with, and we're just probably objectively better at being a certain kind of leader in a certain kind of situation with a certain kind of follower. And in practice, for all leaders at all levels in all organizations, and I'm not just talking to training gym owners, I'm talking about every time we've seen, for instance, a CEO be fantastically successful in a Fortune 500 company, go to another organization and then just burn it to the ground and just have a terrible time and not do very well.
Yeah.
I don't want that to, and certainly I'm not suggesting the takeaway here is like, well, everybody, it's all just luck. It's all going to be a dice roll. You can't figure it out, right? Because of course, life is always a combination of skill and luck, and it's never just one or the other. But
I would say more often than not, I'm painting with obviously a giant brush. Mm-hmm. But I think many of the times when I read case studies about CEOs move from one organizational context to another. The thing that they missed in their transition was they didn't develop and dig into a new self-awareness for how they fit in and serve that new context. They didn't develop new skills about how to manage this new group of people. They brought this toolbox that worked for me here and said, well, I'm assuming it's going to work for me here. And they're not actually receptive to the new environment or the new demands or the new culture. And so they're just, taking the same toolbox that works for them and thinking, well, it made me a great leader here, it's going to make me a great leader here. And that seems to be rarely the case in the case studies that I've read. And so something about that,
Yes.
that cycle of self-awareness and new skill building has to be continuous if you want to continue to lead in new and different ways with different groups of people. I think, I'm beating a dead horse, but does that resonate at all?
Yeah, I think so. I think, as I sort of think through my own context, that maybe version of the conversation we've been having for 11 years is coming out of my own feeling like, well, I probably got lucky, but I bet I'd be screwed if I went somewhere else. What would happen then, And maybe that's, being uncharitable to myself and not allowing for the fact that, just as there are many models and interesting gossipy stories about, oh, this leader was great there and they went there, it was a disaster. It strikes me there's probably also models of people that have now had experience of going from one biz to the other and consistently being successful, even though the contexts are very different. And I just wonder out loud about who are those individuals? I want to be friends with them and and
well,
give myself
the good news is there's
maybe I could do that. I don't know. Maybe I could.
100%. Well, I think the thing is that the skills we're talking about of self-awareness and learning agility, if you bring those along with you, you stand a better chance of being successful there.
Sure.
Right. If you don't bring them with you, right, then it's going to be a crapshoot, right? Because here's the thing, and I think we know this even just from our experience of MFF and MFF year 1 through 3 versus MFF now. We probably could have applied, a strategy in 2012 to MFF and implemented that strategy in a very specific way to 2012. That if we tried that same exact strategy implemented in the same way now, it wouldn't work.
Totally.
Right. And so what's missing if we were doing that is we're us just not having any awareness about how we're perceived or how the team thinks about themselves or what their needs are. And we're not learning new ways of rolling out an idea or communicating strategy. So even in the same organization over periods of time, the culture change, the team change, we have to be responsive to all that because, people are not a monolith, right? They're going to change and evolve over time. And as leaders, if we're not adapting, we're usually getting worse.
Right.
Which I think, which is part of why leadership is one of the most studied topics in the social science literature, right? Is because many of us, leadership is so important in the world, right? We're social creatures who crave leadership. Because leaders, as we know, have such an outsized impact, when they get it wrong, it really fucks shit up. Totally. On all levels. At the individual level, there's trauma. At the group level, there's confusion and contempt. At the organizational level, there's catastrophe, right? And so, we can fuck it up in the society level even further, right? That big organizations can have a real big positive or negative impact. So that's why this topic matters so much, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it more and more. But going back to your initial question to rein us in for a second, I would probably, if I, and I can actually, I'll do a little research. I can do even a part 2 of this, but I would say if we were to look at what the research says about age and leadership, I would guess that it's not that important of a factor. I would guess it's not that important of a factor, only because I think you can have decent enough self-awareness and the ability to continue learning at any age, right? I think I'm talking about adults here. I'm not talking about children.
Sure, of course.
But I would. That's my guess. That's my guess today. It's less of an important factor than many other things.
Interesting. Quick interruption from your old pal Mark to tell you about an awesome free resource for gym owners. Have you ever found yourself overwhelmed because you're not exactly sure where to put your efforts to improve your training gym? Well, you're not alone, and that's why we created this awesome resource. At gymownerreportcard.com, you can access a totally free assessment that will help you identify exactly where to focus your efforts so you can get crystal clear on the next steps to create the gym of your dreams. Head to gymownerreportcard.com. And now back to the show. I think I would maybe vote that maybe age isn't the only decisive factor, because I certainly see the point about the inverse correlation, presumably between self-awareness and flexibility. I think I might vote that the experience thing is going to be a decisive factor, which isn't necessarily age, but that by definition, let's say we're putting a 25-year-old in the best possible setup for a 25-year-old to lead. And a 25-year-old, if you're listening, I say this with great respect and great love, there's just, you just have not.
You haven't done shit yet.
You just haven't done a lot yet, So I could buy that.
Well, I think that makes sense if the context is the same.
Right.
Right. If I stay if I at 25 am the CEO of a bank, and at 45 I'm the CEO of a bank, has my experience as a CEO of the bank helped me become more effective long term? Maybe. But we've both seen examples of that actually the opposite being true, because if you didn't take with you self-awareness, learning agility, you just got set in your ways, and now you can't even see the forest through the trees to help improve an organization that's no longer what it was 20 years ago. Right. So I can see that experience working in both ways. Right. But in part, I'm just trying to see all the sides, because I'm not sure that I don't have a well-informed answer. It's just an intuition.
Yeah, I could certainly see that. I just feels like the net, it is more likely for lack of experience to be an issue than rigidity be an issue. I don't know that that's true, and it's possible I'm betraying, certainly at least one of my attempted life values of learning, and maybe I'm underweighting how rigid people can get because it's so foreign to my life experience. It's like, who would just do the same job every year and not try to get better? How could you not, even if you're an idiot and you're trying to avoid the world, how could you not accidentally learn about yourself and learn about leadership by just getting punched in the face over and over again, right? Which is one of the ways that experience can sometimes, you learn by failing as well as succeeding. But it's possible I'm just now falling into the trap of assuming that's the way most people are wired, and maybe that's not true. But I think in a vacuum, here's another thing. In a vacuum, though, if you had to choose, you don't know anything about somebody, and you have to choose, a 25-year-old or a 45-year-old to lead your startup, who do you choose?
Yeah, well, I would hopefully have an interview process that helps me look for some of the things I care about. And, in interviews, we don't ask their age anyway, right? So I'm not going to be knowing that piece of data. But yeah, it really truly depends. What's the context, and what kind of qualities and attributes are they bringing to the table? Like, I don't know that I would by default look for someone who has more experience. Yeah,
I guess you're right. I guess it's, there could be, I think another thought experiment is there a hypothetical environment where the value of somebody just really being disruptive to the point of almost chaotic really works for certain type of technology, certain type of culture, a certain type of community of individuals creating something together? And I would have to say, probably, there probably are circumstances where that would be better. It is interesting and sort of provocative in the sense that I do think, and again, this is maybe me projecting on society, but at large, we do tend to assume that somebody with more experience is going to tend to, as a rule, have more skill than somebody with less experience. And I still think that's broadly true, but I think through this conversation, I am seeing more value. I think I was maybe underselling the value of the benefits of less experience really being salient in certain contexts.
Yeah, well, 100%. Well, here's the thing. It's like, I want to make sure it's clear. I'm not saying that skills and expertise and real expertise is not a value that people should care about at all, right?
Sure.
If I have an organization who's been financially failing, and it's part because we've been terrible at managing our money, have had an awful CFO who's bumbled the money every step of the way, you better believe the next CFO I'm hiring has some real skills and experience to manage that fucking money, right? Sure. And that's going to be at the top of the list. I'm even cool if they're an asshole, as long as they can manage the money properly, right? I'm saying that flippantly, right? But so skills and experience, if it matches the needs of the organization, might be in the top of the list. But I think more often than not, it's not the first thing I'm going to go to. But actually, it's a fun question. I'll actually do a little research, and maybe we'll circle back to this if I find something compelling, because it's exactly what I'm studying. So I can go ask that question and get lots of smart people to tell me their answers.
It's entirely possible. I'm unearthing some reverse ageism. Can that be a thing where I'm like, I just assume older people are more competent in things, you know? Like, I would also be curious if, I don't know if you've read any of your research, but I am very interested in this concept of crystallized versus fluid intelligence. I'm not sure if that's come up in any of your studies of organizational psychology, but I'm very taken by this idea, even though, once again, I assume this is a trend, and I assume they're, you know, individuals vary wildly, but I find it compelling.
Yeah, it kind of. I haven't read that yet, so I don't know enough about it. But it kind of smells like System 1, System 2 thinking. Was it Kahneman?
Mm-hmm.
Right. There's like a similar kind of like there's two ways of thinking, but I haven't read it, so I'm not sure how similar it is. But yeah, I think those models are fascinating, right? And as we talk about from time to time on this podcast, like models are meant to be shortcuts, and sometimes they're helpful, and there's always another one that contradicts it. But on the whole, I think those sort of mental models are actually super valuable in having conversations like this and trying to understand what is a best practice. You know, what is some evidence that can help guide our decision making, not make our decisions for us, but help guide our decision making. Who study this in ways that they can create a model for me and help give me a shortcut to having the best possible thinking. I think it's so valuable.
Yeah, and I think maybe as a final point here to give our listeners something to take away is, reflecting on, within the many things we've talked about today, what do you perceive with your self-awareness, limited though it may be, listener, maybe you're aware or not, what are the strengths that you think you're bringing into this conversation around leadership? Because I think, part of why I don't want to get too taken with this idea as part of this concept is from a book that essentially makes the argument that how you avoid a midlife crisis is by articulating and acknowledging the things you actually get better at as you get older. So I don't know if part of this is like a gentle, my own sense of like, wow, I'm getting older and I'm getting better at different things now. And that is satisfying to me, and I'm proud of it. And I have a vision of like, oh, wow, if I keep getting better, like I'm going to start getting really good in like 20 years from now. Holy crap. Like at a certain point, cognitively, I'm going to lose a step. But, that's, I think, one of the things I love about working in business, and presume if you're listening, this is you too. It's like you can, peak in your 60s, peak in your 80s, right? If you're taking care of yourself, your longevity, you're going to invariably lose some faculties, is my understanding of the way, cognition, there's some things are going to have some atrophy. I think that's probably inarguable, but a lot of these skills is pattern recognition. And then you have the opportunity to be great version of you now with your unique skills, but then look forward to how you can contribute to organizations and society as you move into an elder and you have a different set of skills. And, that vision is very inspiring to me.
100%, and you're spot on in terms of in terms of the trends and research, right? Like the kind of positive psychology movement has been one of the biggest impact on social science in the last decade, right? And a big part of it is not about just like positive thinking, right? Totally. A big part of it is that there are a lot of positive outcomes when we as humans focus on positive things more often, because we have this bias towards negative. Yeah. And you're exactly right. There's actually a well-studied exercise called, I think it's called the reflective best self exercise. If you Google, I think it's reflected best self or reflective best self exercise. And this is an exercise of I think it's 3 or 4 steps, reflecting on all the great traits and qualities you have as a leader. It asks you to kind of reflect back on 3 different scenes in your life or scenarios or situations where you felt like you were doing your best work or being your best self, and then reflect on the themes throughout them. And, this is an exercise that's been proven to help people clarify their kind of approach and strengths as a leader. And so there's something about, and it's a self-reflection exercise, so it goes with everything we've been saying. Yes. But I think you're so right, Fisher, that part of our job as leaders is to understand what we're bringing to the table, understand how those skills actually reflect the needs of the people we're trying to serve. If they don't, continue to change and grow and adapt those skills over time. And I think as we age, we have more and more chance to acquire more and more skills. And if we learn to use that toolbox in a very adaptive way to serve different kinds of people, you can be a great leader, in all kinds of contexts. Yeah, totally. But I think the one thing I'm trying to work on as a leader right now, and I'm as myself as like as an emerging scholar I hope to be, is to really focus on bridging this gap between kind of research and practice. Sure. Right? Because leadership has been such a widely studied thing for literally millennia, and there's so many leaders out there every day in the trenches trying to lead and do good work and do good shit, and they're so detached from the research. Once in a while, the research seeps through in some great, really accessible books, but often it doesn't. It stays locked up in dissertations and academia. And so what I'm really trying to do as a leader is try to just kind of better understand what we already know, about leadership from the research. What the actual data shows us, and I can help bridge the gap for listeners on this podcast and for people in my life and for myself to make sure that I'm not reinventing the wheel. I can learn from what already exists. And I hope there's more listeners out there who, even though this conversation was maybe a little bit meandering, it goes to the idea that we're really trying to find some truth in what leadership is all about. And I hope one of the places we're looking is in the research. Yeah. And I think that's something I'd like more people to do.
Cool.
Yeah. Was this everything you would hope to be?
All right.
It was fun. I love a surprise.
Chat. I hope if you got the end of this and you liked it, please let us know. If you're like, that was way too heady. Sorry, trained gym owners. You'll have to come along with us for the ride. You bought the ticket, pay for the ride.
I know. Seriously. Well, I think we get one of these once in a while. Yeah. So many of our podcasts are so tactical and they're so down. So we get to have a meandering, somewhat philosophical, maybe even academic conversation once in a while.
The 3% of you super nerds, you're welcome.
Yeah, for some of you who thought this is your favorite podcast, you're welcome. Awesome. Cool. Anything else, Fisher, before we hang up the mics here?
No, it's great to be back. You'll see me again one day.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks again for those of you who made it to the end of this 30-minute podcast. And again, email us and let us know if you any topics you want us to cover, academic or otherwise. Subscribe, like, review us, and we'll see you on the next one. Have a great day.
Hello, beloved listener. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast. This is your loving reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. By giving us some love on your app of choice, you're helping us get the word out to as many gym owners as possible, which means we can invest even more time, energy, and resources into creating the best possible podcast for you. We appreciate your support, and we'll catch you next time.